let's now go into the panel of this afternoon, which is titled Narratives, Expectations, and Accountability. I think in our work in many resource-rich countries, we've all experienced how basically as soon as countries begin to witness or see the potential for oil and gas and minerals, public expectations kind of go off the roof. And a narrative begins to develop as if the country may finally hit the jackpot, and actually all the problems that the country has witnessed up to that point may finally be resolved overnight. Alas, we know that's not often the case. Oil and gas may take considerable time to materialize any benefits, and very often these benefits will not materialize at all. There will be some significant lags in the exploration processes, and at times some of the benefits in financial terms may be squandered before they even make it to the citizens. So there's a clear problem in terms of expectation management that forms especially new oil, gas, and mining producers. And as we know, there's an increasing number of new producers. In this room, we've got representatives from a number of governments, including, for example, Liberia, I guess, but there's also other producers that have recently come on board, such as Kenya, Uganda, Ghana. As companies continue to push the frontiers of their extraction, there's a need to kind of manage public expectations in the countries that discover oil. I want to use only one slide to kind of frame some of the discussions that we're going to have today, and I swear it's going to be the first and the last slide that you see in this panel. But I think it kind of gives us a kind of a flavor of the scale of the challenge that we're facing. I picked Ghana just because it was an example. I could have extrapolated similar types of political statements from any other new oil and gas producers. What I did do, however, was at least to be politically neutral, and I chose statements from presidents of at different points in time, coming from two different ruling parties. I don't need to read the statements, but I think that they do convey fairly well that there is a problem with the political narrative around oil and gas potential in new producing countries. I think this picture that I've taken from a fairly well-known documentary called Big Man, I'm sure you've all seen it, that really kind of gives us a sense of how these kind of political statements can translate into unrealistic expectations at the country level. And Ghana is an interesting example because, and I decided to use it also for this reason, because I managed to find this survey that was done by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation back in 2011, whereby they asked around 5,000 young people between 15 and 35-year-olds about their perceptions on the oil and gas industry in the country and what they thought about it. And the answers that came out of the survey are quite enlightening. About 80% of these young people expected significant economic growth from the oil industry. 64% believed that the oil sector will create more jobs. And more than 50% thought that oil production would be the basis of lasting improvements in living conditions and infrastructure. So this is a concrete example of how a certain type of political narrative can translate into a certain type of public expectation. But there are, of course, problems that arise from this, because if you raise the bar and then those expectations are met, tensions and conflicts may eventually surface. And I think this is the core topic that the panel is going to try to broach this afternoon. I am surrounded by a panel of eminent experts that combine both global and country-level expertise on natural resource governance, and they're going to try to help me answer some of these questions that have been given to frame this debate. Notably, how do notions of natural resource ownership shape narratives? How should governments communicate resource discoveries? What role do the media and civil society play in shaping expectations? And how can we better use data to contextualize and deliver the news? I'm going to first introduce the panelists, and then please do present your organizations in more detail that I'll be able to do. But on my right, we have Ms. Lisa Sachs, who is the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, another organization that has recently changed names. So you can tell us a little bit about the history of the CCSI. Then I've got on my far right, let's go to Peter Harrington, who is a fellow at the Center for International Development of the Harvard Kennedy School. Then on my left, I have Dr. Zhao, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Development at the Myanmar Development Resources Institute, MDRI. And then Sami Atalla, who is the Executive Director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. I suggest to start with you, Lisa, and thank you and thank all of you for being with us today. For some initial considerations on how you think basically this kind of political discourse and the kind of expectations that arise from it create governance challenges that somehow need to be managed at some point. And I'd like some thoughts about what these governance challenges specifically are and how you think that they can be mitigated and managed as we go along.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you for including me. I'm really humbled actually to be on this panel and really looking forward to hearing from the more country-specific experiences of my fellow panelists, but also those in the room I hope we have a chance to hear from. So I hope that I can just provide a little bit of context setting from our global perspective. We're at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, which was recently rebranded from the Vale Columbia Center on Sustainable International Investment, which some of you may be more familiar with, where we do take a comparative global look at some of these challenges related to the governance of extractive industries for sustainable development and try to draw good lessons learned and best practices, and also the challenges that countries have faced in a way to distill useful tools and resources for governments that are newly facing some of these challenges. And for this, with Edward's permission, I'm going to draw a little bit on a workshop that I was really privileged to attend in Morocco not too long ago that was organized by Cosmos Energy and ONUM in Morocco with more than critical support from Critical Resource and from Edward Bickham in particular. So I made some of these comments there and also drawing on some of the lessons I learned from my fellow panelists there who talked about some of the specific country experiences that they had had. So that event, as with this panel, really stressed the importance of managing public expectations around natural resource management, again, sharing both positive experiences, but also some of the real challenges that these countries had faced by not effectively managing expectations. And one of the recurrent themes was the importance of managing expectations from a very early stage, even before countries realize that they need to manage expectations, because that's really when the problems can arise. So there are a number of specific challenges, of course, related to managing expectations in the natural resource sector that I think are unique to the natural resource sector more than any other sector, and these came up in that conference as well. One is the complexity of the industry in general, how especially for stakeholders who are not deeply involved in understanding the timeline of these projects, the uncertainty of development, the geology, et cetera. The complexity, I think, makes that very challenging. The second is the limited availability of information around in the sector, including the pervasive confidentiality still of most contracts or a number of contracts, of the inaccessibility of the laws, and even when they are available, and understanding what they mean and what the implications are. The third, I would say, is around the sensitivities of the resource sector in general, including issues of ownership and other very localized concerns about the impacts, the environmental and social impacts of the sector, and of course the benefits that stakeholders expect to see when resource extraction is taking place in their own backyard. A fourth, this is not an exhaustive list, but a fourth is just the sheer number of stakeholders that are involved and the different interests the different stakeholders have, and therefore the need to really understand what the different expectations and interests and concerns are of the different stakeholders, and also what roles the different stakeholders can play in helping to manage those expectations. So of course, expectations of the benefits tend to be unrealistically high and start at an early stage. That's also true about fears and concerns about potential impacts. And if not managed properly, those can foment into persistent distrust that can persist even after, and this came up in the conference as well, even after the government then does take some steps to try to address it. I think when the seeds are sown of some distrust, it makes it particularly challenging to overcome some of those. In my experience, I think this is particularly challenging in cases where there are really urgent basic development needs. So the expectations of citizens are that they'll see some improvement in their basic livelihoods, which is of course the case in a number of these new producing countries. So there are just numerous examples of when mismanaged expectations cause instabilities, rumors, project delays that are costly from all perspectives, unsustainable pressures for public spending so that politicians feel the need or the pressure to spend early in an unsustainable way and without strategic thinking. And then, as I mentioned, just general distrust of all the stakeholders in the sector. So managing expectations, I think, therefore, is a critical part of resource-based development at all stages of the life cycle, not just really early on where it's very critical, but all the way through how the resources are managed. And again, as I'll touch on again later, it may involve many different stakeholders. So without trying to be exhaustive, I would say one conclusion that I've seen is that inaccurate and exaggerated expectations arise largely when there are information asymmetries. And that can be exacerbated when there's a lack of understanding about the industry, including the timescales and the geological uncertainty. So managing expectations, therefore, is in a large part, but not exclusively, about disclosure and communication, about the timing, the size, the scale, the revenues, how the revenues will be managed, et cetera. Again, that's not an exclusive part of managing expectations. I think other absolutely critical components would be actual engagement and consultations with the stakeholders, so it's not a one-way dialogue, and also very strategic thinking about how the sector can be leveraged for development, because it's not just about communication of the uncertainties, but also having a real plan to maximize the benefits so that at least some of the expectations can be realized. But to focus on one aspect in the sense that disclosure and communication is key, I think transparency has a really critical role to play, both in educating the various stakeholders about the industry, and also to ensure that expectations are then formed on the basis of fact and the reality rather than on rumor. So I'm sure we'll hear more, but there are plenty of examples in which mismanaged expectations have caused political instability. I think two examples that immediately came to mind when I was thinking before were one in Uganda, where the initial refusal, and in some ways persistent refusal to publish the contracts, eventually they're made known to the parliamentarians, but that definitely created distrust and unrest, and I think it was exacerbated when there was political infighting, so when there was disagreement and discord even among the government. I think that exacerbated. And then Paul Collier has given a good example in Tanzania, I think, where the citizens learned about the development of about the prospects for development from social media, and the social media was based on the company's filings because no information had been effectively communicated by the government. And you can imagine how different the company's filings are, which are addressed to their shareholders, versus what the government may want to communicate. So that created very different expectations and some unrest there. I think one lesson learned just from those two examples is also the importance of having a coherent government strategy, and both communication strategy and also strategy for the development of the resources, that this is not in the ambit of any single ministry, but that, or any president to speak of, but that the government as a whole has a coherent strategy, both for how they're going to communicate information about the sector and what their plans are for the sector, because I think discordant messages or apparent political infighting seems to exacerbate some of these misunderstandings. And I think the last thing I would just touch on is that at each stage in the development, I think the strategy will be different, and the information that needs to be made transparent and communicated in order to help manage expectations will be different. All of it should be thought of, I would think, at the outset, but the timing does matter. For instance, I think starting to talk about long-term development benefits, while that's critically important when there are resources, might exacerbate the challenges if you start talking about long-term development benefits before there are even any viable discoveries. So for instance, at the very early stages of exploration, I think that's a critical time to explain the long timeline and time horizon of exploration, how even when there are finds, there's still a very long appraisal period, and even when after the appraisal, there's still no guarantee about what the quality or the size or the scale of the resources will be, and that exploration certainly doesn't necessarily lead to development. In addition to these quotes, there are numerous examples, and one that I was involved in several years ago was in Sao Tome and Principe, where there were just massive pronouncements by the politicians and by the media about how Sao Tome was going to benefit from their oil long before any was discovered. And of course, it's looking increasingly unlikely that Sao Tome is going to find any, if not the scale of the oil that they wanted. So that was certainly a critical time. And in terms of the role that stakeholders can play in that process, I think the media and civil society have a major role to play in that, both positive and negative. I think if civil society exacerbates fears, or if the media exacerbates or overemphasizes the possibilities, that goes a long way in misaligning the expectations. I think there was one interesting example of in Azerbaijan that BP, and this is not exclusive, but BP actually had quite an intensive training program with the media to help explain to the media the sector so that they could more accurately report on the findings, the stage of development, et cetera. And that was actually, Cosmos discussed that as well in Morocco, about the need to work with the media to help educate the media about, they're not experts in the sector, so I think that sometimes the tendency to exaggerate or to misrepresent developments is not necessarily intentional, but is reflective of just not understanding the sector. And then later in development, I think other things become more critically important, like being transparent about the process for allocating licenses, the contracts, the laws themselves, risk assessments and mitigation strategies, the payments and revenues. I think a good case study here is East Timor, which has made quite some efforts to communicate with all of its citizens around those issues. They've made all of their contracts public, they've made their revenues public, they're very transparent about the management of their funds, about the budget, about how the budget is spent. They have a pretty real-time budget transparency portal, and recognizing that not all stakeholders will have the same access to some of these online resources, they actually did somewhat of a roadshow and actually went out to the communities to talk to the stakeholders about some of these issues. And then, of course, once resources are likely, a national development plan can play a major role. So I think that I will end there. Yeah, I'll end there and
Fantastic.
Hopefully jump in later.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think that was a really good framing session, kind of delving into some of the governance challenges that can emerge from unrealistic expectations, but also giving us some very good pointers in terms of how governments can actually address, do better public expectation management, notably in terms of like developing a comprehensive, clear communication strategy. And I really like your point about how this strategy should really be targeted to the different phases of production, because the messaging and the discourse in the political sphere will change as we go along. And I think that would be, that's a very important point. Your initial points kind of give me the opportunity to kind of move on to kind of more kind of context, or rather country level driven remarks, because the next three panelists come with a wealth of experience from three new oil producers, oil and gas producers, or prospective ones in the case of Lebanon. Lebanon is an interesting country because clearly expectations have shot off the roof long before any finds have been made. But it's interesting. I wanted to take one of the points that you made about the lingering effects that lack of transparency or poor public expectation management can have in terms of consolidating and crystallizing some of the distrust that can emerge at the start. And it's interesting, and I'd like to kind of have Dr. Zaou perhaps reflect on this element, because you're from Myanmar, and we all know that Myanmar is undergoing significant political and economic transformations of a pace and scale that I think was simply unmanageable just a couple of years ago. And yet it is a context where you do have this crystallization of distrust, because the country is coming from a certain place. And in addition to that, all of this is taking place in the middle of what could be considered a massive resource boom. FDI in the country has been skyrocketing. I mean, I think it's like doubling on a yearly basis as we go along. And there's the full potential that, you have a mix of reforms, but on the other hand, very strong distrust that has been consolidated by years of difficult relations between the government and citizens. And on the other, a burgeoning industry, which, as Lisa said, is like complex, technical, and it's just inherently difficult to communicate to citizens. And I wanted to kind of get your reflections in terms of like how you're dealing with these challenges in Myanmar, and particularly how and if the EITI in Myanmar is helping in the process of managing public expectations a little bit better and kind of bringing citizens on board. So over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Hello. Well, I come from a country which was ranked by Revenue Watch International last year as the 58th rank in terms of resource governance. So we are quite upbeat about coming to this conference and try to collect all the advice and recommendations and lesson learned. So in a way, I think that really helped my job quite easier in terms of managing the expectations, especially from the development partners and international organizations. But the same is not true domestically inside the country, because when we got the independence from British colonial administration in 1948, we were once touted as one of the most aspiring country. We were the rice bowl of Asia. We have a rich natural resources, so we were at par with Korea and then also many other Southeast Asian countries. But after nearly 60 years, we were quite declined over these years. Of course, it's all started with the grievances among the population inside the country, especially between the majority and then minority ethnic groups, where the resource sharing was become very contentious, and then it eventually led to severe armed conflicts starting from 1950s. And then that also led to the prominent role of the military, which also asserted to become a government itself in 1962. But during the military rule, we were also subjected to severe and very comprehensive international sanctions, which again isolated the country further. So we never had the chance to work with the many development partners over the last 30, 40 years. And during that period, the military regime also became very much dependent on the natural resource revenues, because that's the only source of income that the country could rely upon. So I think that exacerbated the whole issue of the resource dependency and the resource curse. So when we were trying to change that situation for all these years, it was not successful, and then actually the many international observers don't really think high of us becoming, escaping from the resource curse. But fortunately, we had this the accidental election in 2011, which President Thein Sein came to power, and he introduced a series of reforms, which was kind of a miracle to our transition. He started with the political reforms and then also the peace-building processes, essentially tried to bring the country back in line with the international community, and also tried to introduce series of economic reforms. So then EITI was introduced to him. And when he first visited Europe for the first time, he visited Norway. And then also many Norwegian friends actually introduced him the idea of EITI. And then when he came back, he discussed among the leadership, and then the leadership of the government recognized that there's a time that we must escape from the resource curse, and then we must do something about our resource dependence. So he introduced EITI in 2012. And as soon as he introduced, of course, there were all kinds of expectations. Of course, many ethnic groups which are already talking with the government for the ceasefire negotiations, they think that the EITI can be a way towards a more equitable resource sharing. Of course, our situation in terms of revenue collection through the collecting revenues from the natural resources is somewhat dispersed. So there are so many government ministries are collecting all kinds of resource rents. And in fact, the Ministry of Finance is the only ministry that do not receive any rents directly. So in a way, even though we started, the EITI can be a tool for the resource sharing between the central and the local governments, but at the center of the government, the Ministry of Finance itself still needs to consolidate many of these revenues coming directly into the treasury. So I think that was a kind of a challenge. And when we also talked to the many civil society organizations, especially with the human rights group, and they were quite, they were quite satisfied that the government now started to introduce the EITI, and then they also thought that that may be a way to redress many of the transitional injustice that were committed against the populations who are living in the resource-rich countries, resource-rich regions. But of course, EITI may become a tool for improving the human rights protection, but obviously it cannot be used retroactively to redress many of the injustices that were suffered from many parts of our populations. And then also the environmental groups are also quite joining the call for the EITI, because they also thought that this could be a way to conserve our resources that have been overutilized for the last 20 years. So, and then the private sector is also quite, they have a high expectations that once the EITI is signed on, and then the investment rating for Myanmar can be improved, and then they may be receiving all the investment flows into the country, which is already happening to some extent. So I think these are the expectations that that are engulfing the EITI processes in Myanmar. And in the middle of that, and me and a group of colleagues from the think tank, which are already helping the government in terms of economic reforms, being assigned to coordinate these processes. But nevertheless, we were able to utilize most of these willing participation from the civil society, the private sector, the media, and the government to be able to organize the multi-stakeholder group and within a year. And then in last April, we had the 30th meeting of the civil society of the multi-stakeholder groups, which agreed to submit the application. So our application for the EITI went to Oslo in early June, and then we are hoping that we will be granted as a candidate member by the next meeting of the EITI board. So, of course, we have several dilemmas. The one dilemma is EITI has a very unique the schedule of the talks and then the results to be delivered. So these are for within 18 months, we should be able to produce some reports. So they are much more technical in nature, but it's very much a unique tool to address some of these shortcomings of the transparency. But of course, our needs for the resource governance is a long-term process. So I think while we are trying to do the EITI in the short run, we also should not lose sight on the long-term processes, which essentially requires quite a bit of other parallel reforms, not just in the areas of the resource sectors, and especially like a Ministry of Finance, which is now going to become the final host of the EITI Secretariat in the near future. Also needs to build the capacity to manage the resource revenue as well as to manage the EITI processes. So I think, so, and then within the civil society, there's also a need to educate and inform the media. So the media is very critical in terms of shaping the public opinion. And then the way that they have shaped for the time being is more as a kind of a political exercises in terms of raising the awareness of the public on the resource governance situations, and then also raising the plights for addressing the human rights violations, and then also raising awareness on the justice. So that needs to be reinforced further by building the capacity to inform and educate the public about how we can actually manage the resource governance for the long run. And then the second issue is between the transparency, how to go beyond transparency to accountability, which, of course, promoting transparency can be a good starting point, but it cannot necessarily translate automatically into the accountability of the government in managing these resource revenues. So there's essentially a need to further comprehensive reforms in the economic and social sectors, because at the end of the day, I think that the government's ability to manage these resources and invest these resources into the most productive sectors of the government. So the capacity of the government to invest and allocate resources for the most productive sectors is something which we are still building, and which is not, cannot be built immediately. So this is where we are also asking all the development partners to help us build the capacity that can be critical to achieve that kind of the critical mass within the government, within the private sector, and then also the civil society to help, so that we can allocate most of the resources that we can collect from the natural resource sectors to the most productive part of the economy. So I think this is where we are currently debating about conserving many of the resources and then parking them in some sort of a natural, the sovereign wealth type of funding and the saving funds. And then on the other hand, because most of those who argue for that it's recommending us, because we don't necessarily have the kind of essential institutions to manage these resources. On the other hand, there are many of us who believe that we cannot wait until we can have the institutions. We must start reallocating many of the resources into the productive sectors of the economy, because essentially the only path that we can escape from the resource dependency is to have economy which is not necessarily based on the natural resources. So we must start building the labor-intensive industry. We must build the agriculture that can export, and then we must build the economy so that they can manage more knowledge and more information-intensive productive sectors, which in a way is not a distant target, because we also live and then also surrounded by one of the most dynamic economies in Asia. So we are hoping that we can fully integrate with these economies in the near future, and we may be able to start escaping from the resource curse. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's interesting because I introduced you like hoping that you could give us some answers on how the LTI can actually address some of these unrealistic public expectations. And it seems that in Myanmar, in the context of sudden political opening, it has actually done exactly the opposite. Yes. It has further inflamed public expectations, also in terms of revenue sharing. But hopefully, in the long term, it will help address some of these issues of public trust. One thing I also wanted to touch upon, and Lisa already touched on this, is the role of media, which can be a positive and a negative role. I mean, the positive role in that media, when it has the tools and the understanding of the issues, can actually address some of the kind of political narratives that we see on the slide. I mean, trying to kind of really explain to the public how things really are. But it can play a negative role when it simply kind of sticks with these political narratives and it amplifies them further, kind of bringing them like to an ever greater number of citizens. So it is an extremely important role. And I just wanted to kind of take the opportunity to also do some self-promotion. NRGI will be starting a media training program in Myanmar with support from the Norwegian government. The Norwegians keep coming back as an agent of good in many ways. And I don't want to raise your expectations in terms of what we'll be able to achieve, but I certainly have some expectations that the quality of media reporting will hopefully improve over the coming years. Let me move on now to Sami, you and I were in Beirut last week, running a training for civil society and journalists in Lebanon, but also from other countries. But the vast majority of participants were actually from Lebanon. And the excitement in the room was palpable. I mean, people were thirsty for knowledge. They wanted to know more about the oil and gas industry in Lebanon. And yet, Lebanon is an interesting example because there are already figures circulating in terms of the potential of the oil and gas industry in the country, and there's a lot of political bickering around it. Sure. And yet, the country hasn't found any oil. There's not been a single discovery yet. Actually, exploration hasn't even started. So it is an interesting case because it's a case where expectations have started building up long before the exploration process even begins. And it's kind of worrying in a context, as we know, like Lebanon, which is one of heightened political and sectarian conflicts, in many ways like Myanmar. And I wonder how these expectations can actually potentially worsen the political instability in the country.
Sure. And if I may, I'm going to go to the podium just
absolutely.
More comfortable, actually.
Sounds good.
But indeed, Matteo, you're absolutely right. I mean,
before even we've discovered one single drop of oil, the expectations and speculations and conceptions and misconceptions are essentially everywhere in Lebanon. From the minister or the former minister of energy who goes on TV and start giving us figures on what he expects, how much gas or oil we have underground. This is just incredibly unrealistic. Obviously he's doing it for political gains, but it's not very responsible, to say the least. We've got also local governments really getting excited about the oil and gas, and they started thinking, okay, how are we going to transfer it or distribute it to local governments in Lebanon? And I remind them, because I was sitting on a committee tasked to draft a decentralization law. It's a government committee, and around the table, we're talking about the intergovernmental transfer system, and they're saying, oh, how are we going to distribute the oil and gas revenues? I was like, just relax, we haven't even discovered this, People start thinking how to spend it, The civil society is, as Matteo highlighted, really excited about it, but there's, very quickly they feel like, okay, it's going to be stolen. We know it's going to be stolen, and there's sort of, some sort of excitement and malaise oscillates between that. So at the center, the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, frankly, when we started working on oil and gas, I never thought I'll be dealing with expectations or how to manage expectations. And even now, I'm still in denial that I actually am doing something about it. So let me tell you sort of what we're doing, how we started working on oil and gas, and then and sort of highlight how what we're doing, what's our role that's now we're being pushed into because our position right now in the sector. So 3 years ago, we decided that oil and gas should be a major pillar in our center. And we thought that's very important to, in fact, start doing policy research and understanding and learning about the sector to have policy positions. So I'm going to sort of talk about that, and I'm going to talk about how we connected also with civil society. But the center, let me just give you a quick sort of snapshot, was established 25 years ago. And it's actually not bad for a non-government, non-profit center that has no endowment. It relies largely on grants. It's gone up and down in terms of funding, but we've survived. We haven't been captured by anyone so far, especially in a country that's highly fragmented on a sectarian level. And sort of the center played two major roles in sort of the last 25 years that I'd like to sort of maybe shed light on, because they were sort of inspiring for the oil and gas sector. It was the first center as of 1993 talking about electoral reform and changing the electoral system in Lebanon through workshops, publishing books, setting up a civil society network to monitor elections, all the way to 15 years later, 3 of its members were asked or invited by the government to draft the electoral law. Similarly, on decentralization, it's almost the same story. We're the first to work on municipal elections, fiscal decentralization, published books written about it, and held many workshops. And 20 years later, the government asked us to invite 3 of our members again to draft the law. So this is where something that we were thinking of, that actually one learning experience has been, we really have to understand the issue, learn ourselves, educate our colleagues in civil society, and create this critical mass. And just get people excited about the issue and make them understand it. And right now on electoral reform, there's a whole network, or NGOs working on pushing for that independently of us, which I think was great because sort of it spills over into other civil society networks that come into existence to particularly do that. So the oil and gas hype started a couple of years ago, and we said, okay, look, we really need to do the same thing. We really need to learn this issue. Let's get going. We got a grant, and we said, okay, let's actually run with it. But here's the problem. One is that we're not studying something that already exists, so it's not anything analytical or anything to describe for that matter. It's very largely prescriptive. How do we do, what are the best contracts for Lebanon? How do you manage revenues? Should we have sovereign wealth fund? These are all hypothetical issues and questions. So in a way, we wanted to be ahead of the curve. We wanted to learn about them, do our homework, so we have a policy position. We have a policy, like, to advocate something, we need to have done our work. And in fact, that was a really key component, a key pillar in our research. But this time, we decided to do something different. Instead of doing our research and run workshops, and in the workshops, after 8 months or 9 months of work, we'll invite the minister of so-and-so, or in this case, the Minister of Energy would come and cut the ribbons and say nice words in half an hour, and then he leaves, and half the crowd leaves with him, and we're left with a group of people who are already converted. We're just talking to each other, and maybe the debate is about whether we should do this or that, a very minor difference. I mean, to me, this is interesting, but to me, at this stage, we thought we needed to, break the threshold and do something a little bit different. So we actually contacted the Lebanese Petroleum Administration, which is a government body that is responsible for governing the oil and gas. And we, in fact, introduced ourselves and told them what we're doing. And to cut the story very, very short, they got excited about it. They said, yeah, sure, we'll work with you. Well, I'm making it very short and brief. It took 9 months. You could have a child, to do that. But, finally, we managed to sign an MOU where we decided to work on the specific issues. And to us, the specific issues, let me sort of highlight why they're so important. We know from the literature, sort of let's link the literature, that the oil and gas is conditional on the kind of institutions you have and the human capital in your country. And Lebanon is endowed with a high human capital, so we're fine with that. But the institutions, oh no, we're nothing to boast about. We have really institutions. Our institutions don't hold any checks and balances. It's very much sectarian-based, which means also that it's highly personalized politics in a weak democracy driven by patronage. So you could imagine, you fuel that with oil and gas revenues, and you're gone essentially from sort of things that we're concerned with here. So there are no institutional capacities to maintain these checks and balances, and we thought, look, can we change that? Can we think about changing our institutional settings, knowing very well they're path dependent? But the gentleman yesterday at the UK Customs didn't think so. He asked me, why are you here? I told him I'm coming to give a talk. He said, where? I said, Oxford. What about? I was like, oil and gas. What about oil and gas? I told him, well, we're trying to figure out how we can stop the corruption and embezzling. And he looked at me and said, forget it. I'm like, all right, thank you so much for your encouragement, but we have to try. In any case, we started working with the LPA, which is the Lebanese Petroleum Administration, and we started, which was really actually very new to us. Never actually ever, we worked from day one. We didn't launch the project until they got on board, until we delayed the project for 9 months. We said, look, it's worth it. If they're on board, let's wait for them. And in many ways, it's been very interesting because this is a group of not your typical bureaucrats. They're all sort of technocrats coming from all sort of different backgrounds, from UN, from the sector, and so forth. And so the relationship would go as follows. We'd work together. We decide what workshops to hold, what topics. They review the papers. They give comments, and everything's very reasonable. To be very objective and fair, this is very reasonable engagement in terms of and their opinions. They never wanted us to censor anything. They sort of they're like, give it to us. That was, so to us, that was really, really positive sign. And then we had these workshops. We're like, okay, look, one problem with this research is it takes forever. Sort of, people do research, 8, 9 months, you know, and if you're lucky, the book is out in a year and a half. So we decided to hold workshops because we said, like, you know, there are sort of things are happening in Lebanon, we need to have this debate, you know, at the end of the day. And interestingly, we held 3 workshops together, and generally they're closed, and we decide on who the speakers are, what the topics are, and so forth. And I must say that, in fact, as we progressed and we built confidence and trust, we're getting into more sensitive issues. At the beginning, it was very much like general strategy of what we've done, give us comments and give us feedback. So all 6 members of the LPA, by the way, all there. It's very interesting. They take it seriously. They come and debate and defend, you know, which I think is lovely because we've never seen that in Lebanon. Never seen such a dialogue happening between a group of experts and government officials. And then next time we had another one on environment, you know. And then the third time when we came to discuss or think of the topics, they said, okay, what topics should we do? I was like, look, there are 3 draft decrees that the government hasn't voted on. Why don't we talk about these decrees, draft decrees? I mean, the debate should happen before the decrees are passed, not after, obviously. Because after, there's nothing much to talk about. It's a done deal. And here sort of opened up a whole question about, you know, well, do we want to make it open or not? Do we want to be transparent or not? Not that the fact that they were hiding anything, but just concerned about this whole culture of opening up, getting criticism, but yet they were eager to show that they're different. And in fact, there was a whole debate, and we came to an agreement, or a halfway solution, that we don't make it public, the whole draft decrees, but we make one of our member, who's an oil and gas expert, sign a non-disclosure agreement, who would review and give comments. We're like, we can live with that. At least, you know, they'll present the decrees, draft decrees, and some of us will do the critique, you know, sort of based on well-informed. And frankly, that went very well, you know, and that created a whole discussion and so forth. But with time, you know, realized that as they're opening up and so forth, I'm going to get back to that later on, but sort of highlight, it created some sort of, they were being criticized by experts and scholars, and not them specifically, by the way. Some of them, it's not about the LPA itself. Some it's about the government, about the corruption, about the sectarian system, how that it's going to be very, very hard is actually to do much. But nevertheless, they kept on the process. At the center, we felt that this is okay. This is very good. We're happy with this sort of engagement, but that's not enough for us because we want to push for the accountability from the civil society network. And this is where we started working with civil society. And as Matteo rightly suggested, our first thing to do is let's inform them and educate them what the sector looks like. Because it's much more complex than other things. It's not about municipalities and service delivery. It's not about election and electoral reform. It's about the whole value chain. There are all different aspects and so forth. And I think the training that we held last week was very successful and very useful to sort of informing them about it. Now, and then we're building on that. We're building a coalition. That's fine and nice, you know, trying to do that. In fact, next week we're holding a civil society meeting. And then we're using the policy knowledge that's being produced by our experts to actually feed that. Because what are we going to advocate? You know, well, you need knowledge, you need positions, you know. And this is sort of a nice way to sort of bring the whole circuit together. You start with doing policy research with the LPA, but at the same time, you don't put all your eggs in one basket thinking that, you know, they're going to change things. You create a civil society coalition, hoping that will actually push for change. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. We get to see. This is what we're facing. But here's the trick. The trick has been, in fact, all of this is nice and easy and this is all is planned, but what I didn't really expect, frankly, is that there are other challenges that we're facing that we didn't really think ahead of. One is that civil society is very convinced that this is going to be embezzled and corrupt. And they might be very, very well right. But what's interesting is that there's some sort of what we call selective hearing. They only take the information that's negative to confirm what they've already thought of. So for instance, if we have someone, an expert who would say, or an expert, but his expertise is not in drilling, and would say, well, you know, you've got a 15, you might find oil and gas 15,000 meters below sea level, but there's no technology for that. They're like, so what is the government hiding from us here? What's going on here? So and it leaves people sort of, you know, it's very easy to confirm their preconceived notions or biases, and I think that sort of thing totally we didn't really think of. Wait a minute, is how do we actually manage this? The other thing I'd like to sort of shed light on is a different type of maybe misconception or expectations that we're facing. As I mentioned, the LPA sort of opened up its door and said, let's talk. And frankly, that's a very good step. Now, as they're receiving these comments and feedback and being attacked, or they're also doing selective things. It's because they only hear that they're being criticized. They only hear, even if the experts are not criticizing them as the LPA, but criticizing the whole sector and the whole setup, the institutional setup in the country, they're starting getting nervous about this. And what's interesting is that this is a different type of expectations that we're trying to manage, is to convince them to keep on walking the road, keep the process open. Because essentially, what sometimes we feel is they want to close it. They're like, we know what, we're fed up with this. Why are we opening it in the first place? And I hear this on a day-to-day level because I work closely with them on organizing the workshop, and they're like, oh, now guess what? We heard this. Someone said this in the media, and someone said this. Someone commented on this because so and so and so forth. And here we are like, oh, wait a minute, guys, we should have thicker skin. But that's easily said than done because, in fact, from their position, they're being attacked and they see it as a sort of attack on them. So these two sort of issues, in many ways, I must admit that from the civil society perspective and trying it to set up a coalition and to monitor the sector, we're dealing with their own set of biases that we didn't really carefully think of, and I think we should, in terms of the selective hearing, in terms of confirming that this is going to be sort of stolen, and counterintuitively from the LPA that opened up its sort of the door for some sort of discussion and openness, and they get criticized, and their instinct is to close. And this is really fresh from the, as they say, from the oven, because we're witnessing that as I speak in terms of this sort of dynamics that we're trying as the center. Next thing you know, we're sort of walking on a tightrope between sort of managing the expectations, building confidence and trust, informing and educating the civil society, at the same time keep the whole thing sort of holding in terms of keeping that institutional setup, informal institutional setup going to have positive effect on the sector. I'm asked to stop, so thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sami. I think it's, again, a confirmation of how transparency and participation can perhaps help in the long term, but in the short term they create a number of challenges that someone needs to manage, especially if the public dialogue is somewhat unsophisticated and needs to be helped grow and advance. And I do think it's interesting how, what the role of institutes like yours, but also MDRI can play in this process, kind of working with the government as you go along and make sure there are no setbacks in this public consultation process. But that in itself is challenging because it takes a lot of dialogue, consultations, building trust with them. But then you can also play that role with other stakeholders. In your case, but also in the case of MDRI, you do a lot of work with civil society, trying to kind of build this critical mass of citizens, as Paul Collier calls it, which is essential, the essential other side of this equation. So I think it's very interesting. But without further ado, let's move to the last panelist, and which is Peter Harrington, who's currently at the Center for International Development of the Harvard Kennedy School, but used to be the deputy head of the Africa Governance Initiative in Liberia. You spent a couple of years in Liberia, and you were involved in policy and communications advice to the government, to a number of institutions, including, I understand, the presidency and the National Oil Company. And I'd like to kind of get your thoughts in terms of how it was to work in that kind of context. And one parallel that I'd like to draw is the case of LPA in Lebanon is interesting because there was somehow a demand coming from LPA. Or at least you tried to build that demand, and there was a willingness to work with you. The dynamics between international donors and governments in most of the countries that we work are very often different. In fact, there isn't really a demand. We try to create that demand. There's more of a supply on our part. But that raises the questions about what are the ultimate incentives that drive, let's say the counterparts, the government counterparts, and how those incentives can help in address some of these public expectation management challenges, or actually maybe an hindrance if the incentives are wrong. So tell us a little bit about your experience in Liberia, and yeah.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Thank you for having me. and to the other panelists as well. It's really exciting to be here on a very prestigious panel. One of the advantages of going last is that everyone's probably had a bit of a chance to digest their lunch, so I hope that's going to work in my favour. I'm going to try and keep it brief, though, all the same. Matteo and the organisers asked me to focus on my experience on the ground. I had quite an unusual experience seeing an African NOC from the inside. Of course, many people here work on the inside of African NOCs and NOCs elsewhere in the world, but I'm going to try and give a bit of an outsider's perspective. And I'm also going to try and be a bit provocative, just because I don't work for the organisation anymore that I worked for at the time, and we're under Chatham House rules, although I'm not quite sure how that works when you're being live streamed to the internet.
We're not under Chatham House rules in this role.
But no one uses the internet, right? So that's kind of that's sort of
that's your side.
Right. Okay.
Don't vouch for it.
So anyway, as Matteo said, I spent almost 3 years in Liberia with AGI. I was working alongside Liberian counterparts in the government. AGI's model is embedded, so you're shoulder to shoulder on a day-to-day basis. And I'm going to try and focus on. We've talked a lot about the sort of need for managing expectations. We had really good framing discussions, but I think I'm going to try and focus on what it's like to actually try and do this, why that's so difficult, and highlight some of the problems and the challenges that I see. I'm going to try not to be too... I'm going to try and get the right balance of pessimism and optimism, because I am optimistic. So I worked inside NOCAL, which is the Liberian NOC. We had 2 goals of my work plan, which was one, to build capacity within NOCAL to spearhead a reform program within government. And the second part was to rapidly, dramatically improve the ability of the government to do communications around oil. Previous to that, I was in the presidency, as Matteo said, and I was involved in some speechwriting, trying to prevent President Sirleaf from saying things like that, with moderate success. But really, the way I saw my work inside NOCAL was working on the supply side of good governance, so basically trying to help make these reforms happen, and AGI's work is process-oriented. It's not advising on policy or content. But stimulating the supply side, but then also stimulating the demand side of good governance, so working to build media capacity, public understanding, public education. That supply and demand side, I think, is relevant for a lot of the things we're talking about here. Liberia's first discovery happened about 4 days after I walked in the building for the first time, and the country went absolutely oil berserk. Front page of every newspaper for about 6 months was oil, oil, oil. I used to refer to it as oil vuvuzela. Those of you who are fans of the South Africa World Cup, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say oil vuvuzela, just constant, really intensive noise and scrutiny. Many of the sort of same things and dynamics that my fellow panelists have talked about. And there was a lot of challenges with trying to manage this. It was sort of firefighting, kind of rearguard action. There was no public affairs department, no communications department in the National Oil Company. There was a lot of resistance in the organisation to having an outsider. There's a lot of opacity. No one had ever heard of NOCAL, and most Liberians were very reasonably saying, who on earth is this NOCAL, this organisation we've never heard of, which is now the custodian of, as far as we know, is this kind of lottery win. And there was a lot of lack of capacity in NOCAL as well. So we were sort of, running as fast as we could. I was working with a sort of small group of reformers who the president had appointed in to take charge of the National Oil Company, and that critical mass that included the president's son, which has caused controversy, and we can certainly talk about that. But that's something that people tend to have heard. I just want to, having highlighted some of those challenges, sort of draw out 5 themes which I think which the Liberia story and my experience in Liberia really illustrated. The caveat is every country's different. It's only one illustrative case, but I think these 5 themes are crucial. The first we've heard a lot about already, which is trust. I think it's been really already well highlighted by my fellow panelists. It is the foundation, and it's usually at a very low base, because often communications in such contexts have already been weak, government communications, and NOCAL was this kind of black box. So there was zero trust, no brand, no sort of community projects, very little, very few community projects. And it takes a long time to build, and you need a very proactive strategy and communications and so on. Lisa's right, you need to get out to people and not just do newspaper and radio. You actually need to get out into the community and do do a great variety of types of communication and engagement which are going to match the audience and the people that you're speaking to. It's no good. And a thing that a lot of people tend to do is, you know, external advisors come in, you do a nice strategy, it doesn't go anywhere. So you have to do what's workable and what's realistic. My mantra about communications when I was in Liberia was, communications is not about what you say, it's about what you do. And of course, your message is important, the narrative is important, but unless you have a program of reforms that you actually execute and you actually do things that you're going to say, then your communications are meaningless and the trust is worse than if you never started in the first place. So you have to have a program of real actions that get implemented that you can then communicate and use and draw attention to build trust. But it was incredibly uphill battle even within NOCAL to get the budget published for the first time or commit to an international audit. And there are all sorts of stakeholders within country who are working against those even very early sort of green shoots of attempts at reform. I'll come back to some of those stakeholder issues in a minute. I think the other thing that Lisa said, which I really agree with, is that people talk a lot about strategy and messaging and what's the narrative. In a place like Liberia, what people want to see is results. You know, you can say, oh, look, here's a nice EITI printed book with all the revenue such and such. And they're like, great, where's my latrine? And so actually, unless this kind of work is accompanied with, unless it translates into real development outcomes that people can see, which are tangible, which is, you know, miles of road or you know, houses, you know, connected to the grid and so on, that's what's really impactful, and that's what will convince people that money isn't just being squandered and stolen. The second, so the first thing was trust. You know, second is corruption. It's crucial. It's very, you know, it's universal in every country. And I think I can give some stories if we have time for discussion about examples in Liberia. Conscious that the internet is watching. And transparency is essential. I think that we've talked a lot about media and CSOs. This is one of the areas where I want to be a little bit controversial. The media, there's a lot of talk about you've got to get the media capacity developed. That's important for this demand side, to have stakeholders in civil society who are demanding good governance from the government. But actually, oftentimes, the media aren't what they seem. Local civil society organizations aren't what they seem. Every day there was a new organization for oil in Liberia, and what it was basically it was racketeering to extract money from the national oil company. So you have to be careful and differentiate who's actually working for, you know, sincere, constructive ends, and you know, which organizations are just sort of also fronts for members of the legislature or elsewhere in society who are wanting to obstruct reforms. Yeah, I'm really trying to get under the bonnet a bit here, because otherwise we just tend to talk in sort of best practice terms, and it's about what really happens on the ground. Likewise with the media, I mean, you know, there was to give you an example, there was an article where the figure of 14 billion potential total value of the Chevron investment in Liberia could possibly be, and the journalists in Liberia took that 14 billion and said, well, that's what Chevron paid for the oil assets that they took in Liberia, which cost about, frustratingly, cost 14 million. But just the simple, you know, sort of a simple misunderstanding like that meant that there was day after a week of headlines saying, where's the missing 14 billion? And just trying to say, wait a second, that was a theoretical number that someone in the US embassy came up with, not actually, you know, not actually any money that's been paid, is incredible. You're already starting way behind the line. So there's a huge problem with media capacity. There's a huge problem with money for articles. There's a huge problem with people who want to attack the reforms, or a small cabal of reformers, if they're there, who want to come after them and who will use the media, and a media which because journalists are underpaid, there are too many newspapers, it's not an efficient market of media, it's very susceptible to that. So it's great to do media capacity building and do workshops, but, you know, make sure people aren't turning up for a free lunch, basically. I know I'm being I don't want to sound pessimistic, but this stuff can be done, but there's a lot of messiness in there as well. Main point, well, one of my main points, transparency is great, and there are a lot of, by the way, you know, international NGOs who rightly bang on about transparency. Global Witness sometimes can cause as much of a of a headache. I think Sammy was absolutely right when he talked about the sense that government tries to give a little bit and still get hammered for it and then just want to retreat. You're absolutely right. I saw that day after day, and it was a constant battle to try and say, look, keep going, keep trying, it'll build that trust. But transparency is nothing without capacity. If you publish EITI data and people in civil society don't know how to read it, or if the EITI secretariat in the country doesn't know how to use and process this information, then transparency doesn't get you anywhere. So it's very important, but it's not enough on its own. This is where data, by the way, the theme of this conference, this is where data is really important. But data is only powerful in these contexts if it's really well refined, well packaged, and customized to the audience. There's no use just doing a complicated sort of data visualization. You've got to package it, and no one's doing that. I had to do it myself to try and take some of this complicated stuff and translate it into simple 3 slides that can be taken into a particular community. So it has to be well refined. But the capacity thing is crucial. You also need capacity in government, so on the supply side and on the demand side. I think we need an EICI for capacity to build on an EITI, and watch this space. Final thing about external support and outsiders, and I think this is where things get much more difficult, is that on the whole, and I'll be provocative and so people can sort of, come back at me, donors, aid workers, technical advisors, a lot of people in this room, myself included, most of the time don't really have any idea what's really going on or the real reason why things are happening or not happening around oil sector reforms. And we have to change the way we approach this and approach support programs to recognize and navigate the deep political economy in the country around, protest groups that have been paid for, or a civil society organization, or a media story. And we spend a lot of our time guessing, and most of the time we're wrong. And I think getting glimpses, it was only after the very end of 3 years I had tiny glimpses of the kind of 80% of the iceberg that was under the water. Whereas you've been sitting, working, doing nice advisory programs, this is great, it's going really well, it's fitting into our, monitoring and evaluation framework, and then suddenly things run into a complete sort of impasse because there's deep political economy issues which, and I'm not talking about, it's too simple to say it's corruption, it's about the complex web of relationships, motivations, incentives, obligations within the elite and outside the elite in the country, which really decide what happens and what doesn't happen. And a lot of that comes down to what extent is there political will at the very top to actually do enough, to grow the pie enough and be good enough to move things forward. I'm not being pessimistic, I just think you have to have just a critical mass of desire to move forward and do things well enough, not perfectly. We have to stop expecting people to do things perfectly. So just to sum up, there's a lot of technical challenges in getting communications right. Absolutely, it's coordination, it's having the right strategy, it's having capacity in government, doing all the packaging. Transparency is essential. You need good partnerships with industry, but people want results. And I agree that there's no accountability. It doesn't translate into accountability until you have actual reform, and that's as important as what you say. And data is crucial in all of those technical areas about if you refine it and package it well. But the real challenge in getting narrative, expectations, accountability, I think, right, is about engaging with that deeper political economy, adapting the way external supporters do their support. And I'm certainly happy to give a few thoughts about that, but I'll leave it there as sort of, food for thought for now. Thanks.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much. I realize that I've never really poor job at time management, but I was honestly hooked by all these panels, and I wanted to give the panelists all the time they deserved. But that inevitably has eaten into some of our discussion time. We have around 15 minutes, so without further ado, I'd like to go on to the questions, and perhaps start with taking 3 questions, if there's any, and then we'll see if we can take some more. Sheila, please. Is there anyone with a mic? Yeah. Does anyone else want to poke himself? Okay, second person. 3? Okay, we've got 3 questions already.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that this is really one of the very important issues about the communication and the role of knowledge and then trust in making that happen. And so, quite rightly, because the last speaker and the one before him for that matter, recognized that it was much more than the ability to communicate, but that it was about the broader macro environment in which the conversation is taking place. And so it begs the question, isn't that what we should be talking about? Because many of you probably know that there is this NGO in New York called the Elderman Barometer, and they do a survey every year, and they assess the level of public trust in two areas, in governments and civil society, and including media, who for reasons that I think are flawed consider media civil society, though it is a big business, but never mind. They classified it as civil society. But they also check the level of trust in the public of large companies. Now, who do you think is the least trusted? Is governments and multinationals. And yet, those are the entities whose messages you are trying to communicate. So it seems to me that more than how and what to communicate, it is how to reconstruct the relationship. Quite how you do it, I don't know, but I do think that if we accept that the two entities who are custodians of this industry worldwide are considered the least trustworthy, you shouldn't be surprised, my brother from Lebanon, that they say, yeah, because this is the nature of the world they know. And 2009 crisis gave them reason to know why they shouldn't trust these two institutions. And now in Lebanon, on the edge of that international implosion of the economy, you are trying to get them to trust this. I think it's an unstarter. I think we should be thinking of a different point of departure. But I'd be interested to hear your views. This is what I wanted to share. Thank you very much.
There was another question here.
Thank you. Yako Kuroshi from Chatham House. My question to the panel is, who are the authoritative, credible voices in the countries that can balance expectations? And the reason I'm asking that, I just want to give you three very short examples of numbers that are being thrown around. So the first one that I had to think of when you were debating was the $1 trillion worth of resources that were found in Afghanistan by the Pentagon, and then in the New York Times, and then all over the world. The second example that I wanted to give you is actually comes from the Africa Progress Panel, who put a wonderful report together last year. But if you were reading it carefully, the tenor was that if only you manage resources rightly, that could become the growth engine for African economies, which is certainly true for some African economies, but where there's big question marks for other African economies. So again, a kind of inflation of expectations. And the third one was, on Monday, I spent the whole day in Cambridge debating shale gas and the prospects for shale gas in the UK. And if you look at it in greater detail, you will see that there's only one well that ever has been fracked in the UK. And there's certainly no question that this will suddenly create a huge boom. But you have the Prime Minister on TV, and you have the British Geological Survey, and everybody's getting very excited about it. So that begs the question, who are the possible counterweights to this kind of a debate? Thank you.
There was another question from, who was that? Okay.
So you don't have to
Yeah,
run.
absolutely.
My name is Valerie Marcel from Chatham House also. We're a little group here. I was just going to comment too that we talk about government and, whether government is a trusted messenger or an efficient messenger, conveying the right message. But really, there's a very big difference often between what civil servants say and what elected officials and non-elected officials say. And in the case of Lebanon, it's interesting. The Petroleum Administration kind of came forward as, yes, we do want to talk reasonably. Maybe they didn't do it perfectly, but we do want to provide information, because I think they're fully conscious that it's being sort of sucked into a vortex of political debate that is not grounded in actual technical reality. So I think it's worth identifying the difference, because it means that you can rely more and should task civil servants more with delivering these messages.
Professor Kuo up there, and then Gavin.
Thank you. The bottom line that I note from this conference is change of decision, and seems to me that the idea of decision is start from the interest of extracting the resources instead of policy or commitment to reach the bottom poor in the society, as the speaker in the morning specified. Now, because we start from the interest of extracting resources, then the concern on accountability, transparency, and trust are emerging. But from countries which are not really start from democratic situations like Myanmar, I suppose, the idea of long-term policy and also commitment to strategic issue is not necessarily popular are gaining importance. I just need to comment from our colleague from Myanmar how you see the trade-off between long-term commitment to the poor in the society and on the other hand concern on popular control and transparency and so forth, which not necessarily lead to strategic policies. Thank you.
So there are three more questions, but I'd like to kind of be effective perhaps in responding to the three first ones that have been asked. And perhaps, I mean, the last question has already been addressed to Dr. Zha. The question perhaps about the environment in which these conversations take place and kind of how do we kind of reconstruct these relationships. I mean, I think kind of it's maybe answered like best by Sami. And perhaps I'd like you to kind of jointly provide an answer to this issue of like who are the credible voices and how also like do we enable the technocrats to kind of be the key messengers to the public, which is an interesting point, but is also challenging in many ways. Shall we start with you perhaps from the last question, Dr. Zha?
Well, thank you very much. I think this is essentially the dilemma that the government is facing right now, how to commit for the long-term sustainability of the resource use, whereas our current flows of the resource revenue must be used to boost the delivery of the benefits to the population. For the time being, we are still struggling about the delivery of the reforms, because we have started quite a bit of reforms in every facet of our politics, economics, and social arena. Our economic reform has some sort of a time lapse, which we haven't really seen the delivery of the tangible and early results to the population. This is where we are constantly facing all kinds of pressures from the political parties, from the civil society, and many ethnic groups to spend quite many of the populist policies on the poverty reduction, on the subsidies for the agriculture, on the incentives for the SMEs and things like that. So this is where I think it's very critical for the resource-rich country like ours to be able to formulate and develop a kind of effective long-term strategy to escape from the resource dependency and try to move towards the kind of a dynamic economy that can rely on the other productive aspects of the economy. So we are trying to work on the agriculture reform, we work on the SME reform, and we are also working on the other reforms that can actually move Myanmar away from the resource dependency. And then we are hoping that it can succeed, because we are also surrounded by the ASEAN and then also the East Asia dynamic economies, and so that we can have some sort of a good neighborhood benefits. And then on the question about the larger, the political economy versus the transparency initiative like EITI, in our case, it is quite almost impossible to tackle the larger environment because our needs and the shortcomings are quite severe and quite large. So in a way, the EITI is a kind of a opportunity for us to address and then also try to pool the critical mass. And then through that, we can actually scale up. That can affect the larger political economy. So in a way, that was one of the reasons that we are giving high priority on the mechanisms like EITI and other initiatives that can provide maybe a little bit of more technical way to allow us to proceed to the more politically sensitive areas.
Great. Perhaps moving on to Sami on the question of how we
Sure. Yeah, but just quickly, I don't know if I was misunderstood about my surprise about the CSOs, but let me just sort of rephrase it maybe. By no means I'm surprised that the CSOs, civil society, are concerned or think that it's going to be corrupt. By no means, this is totally normal. What actually I tell the LPA in my meetings, then why are you surprised? I mean, we've had 20 years of reconstruction since 1990, and there's a lot of big corruption, embezzlement, contracts, money disappearing, all sort of things. So I'm telling them, look, I mean, you have a baggage. It's not your responsibility, but there's a whole environment that you're coming here to operate in a different way. But the environment is really, and the history is really very much against you. So I totally sympathize, and I see what the civil society is feeling about it. I actually think that I'm a bit surprised why the Lebanese Petroleum Administration, sometimes they feel surprised by the reaction, you know what I mean? Now, I can see what they're doing. They're trying to be different. It's like, but it's like, why me? Why are you picking on me? It's almost like this. This is what they're saying. But the big picture, I think, and there's a fundamental issue that, sorry, the woman in green and yellow, you've highlighted for Sheila. Hi, sorry, Sheila. Sheila, by no means, at least from my end, I assume that, and I think you very much highlight the issue of the companies and the government and the public trust. I don't know, my colleagues, and I don't know when this session was framed, is there a major assumption that the government is benevolent or the companies are, benevolent? I don't start with that, by no means. That's not my take on this. I think the issue of communication and setting the expectation is the tip of the iceberg, with very big question mark for me, at least, on the role of the government, their objectives, their way they want to split the pie, away from the public scrutiny. So I definitely agree with you. In fact, at the center, that's what we've been working on issues related to, for example, the public trust vis-a-vis elections. We have a major concern. Local governments, corruption. We've been doing this sort of thing, for 25 years, particularly because we have no trust in the central government and now. So by no means I'm coming in thinking, oh, this is the only problem is about communication. You know what I mean? At least from my angle, that's not the message I'm trying to sort of send. But I say that the government right now, highlighting the role of the minister, for example, definitely is not helping. In fact, speculating and using this whole issue of the data and so forth for political gains. And that's really even worse now than when we were asked. How do we create, the big question, if there's a room to create a space for this dialogue, for this positive environment in a sea of mistrust, corruption, embezzlement on the wider scale. This is in fact what we're at the center. We're finding out ourselves is that if we're able to get the LPA from one hand, we're able to get the CSOs, and we're trying to sort of almost like draft sort of a room where we can actually sit down and have substantial talk about the sector. I don't know how it's going to go. I mean, very frankly, maybe that's why we're hoping the civil society will create a spillover effect. Will they be able to influence? These are very big questions, but really, I mean, this is very going to be speculative, and we're hopeful, but this hope is everything we've got at this stage, frankly, when we're battling with big companies, multinational, huge stakes here. This is not about reconstructing Lebanon. After the war, we're talking about $15 billion or $5 to $10 billion of reconstruction over 20 years. This is going to be like much bigger, and hence the stakes are higher. Everyone wants a piece of the pie. So, so the odds are against us, but we keep on trying to limit at least the damage.
Sure. So 4 quick thoughts on the comments from our colleagues from Chatham House. So in terms of credible voices in country, I mean, I think in terms of the public, the voices, it's certainly in my experience, who were most trusted were organizations like Global Witness and Revenue Watch Institute, the local Transparency International chapter. I think the problem with that is that often those organizations, I mean, I've got, thin ice here, aren't on the ground all the time, and so don't always know the full reality of what's happening behind the scenes. I mean, Global Witness are great. I'm a huge, huge fan, but they made life as difficult as they helped in the case of Liberia, really seriously. And I was debating back and forth with them a lot of times about this particular model they have. So I think there is a problem with how effective those voices can be. And I think short of that, there isn't really, I suppose my second and connected point is that there's this idea that, well, we just need to get the data and the numbers. If the public only knew the facts, the reality, then it would be fine and expectations would be managed. But the thing is, as you rightly pointed out, there's crazy debate in the UK. It's not merely a capacity or availability of information problem. There's just misinformation, misunderstanding, inaccuracy rampant everywhere. And so you have to do what you can to get accurate information out there and package it right and build capacity, do all these things, but acknowledge that it's still going to be messy. It's still going to be a cacophony of debate because there are all sorts of people with different agendas and who have very different incentives and motivations, and so it's just always going to be noisy in that sense. I think third quick point is that I'd emphasise again this point that trust in the government, I think, comes from delivering results, actually delivering tangible development results. Yeah. No matter how good your communications are, no matter what you say, how much information, how amazing your website is, there's no substitute for actually just doing stuff. That's what builds trust. And then finally, on to Valerie's point, I totally agree. The bureaucrats and the politicians are very different, and I'd go much further. There's actually 20 or 30 different groups of stakeholders that you should segment within government. There's bits of the executive, there's state-owned enterprises, there's legislators, there's senators, and they all have a slightly different game to play and a different sort of, agenda and cards that they can play and using the means at their disposal. I think one of the most useful things that external advisors can do is to try and bolster the bureaucrats to execute this technical stuff because it's worth doing, in spite of the fact that it will never fix it completely. To do absolutely everything you can, do it as well as possible, and then try and rein in the politicians with saying stuff like that, which just makes the mountain even higher that you're trying to climb. So it's difficult. I think really good comments. That's it from me.
Fantastic. I want a time check. I mean, do we have a coffee break right now, right? So I know there were some additional people that wanted to ask some questions, and at least 3 of them. I just encourage you to come down and ask your questions directly to the panelists during the coffee break.
Get between people and then
Thank you very much.
Thank you.